The widow Eleanor Marsh had buried one husband and sworn on his grave she would never let another man close enough to break her heart. And she meant every word of it right up until the morning a dusty, sun-bronzed cowboy pulled her wagon out of the mud on the western edge of Laramie County and tipped his hat like he had all the time in the world. It was the spring of 1879, and Wyoming Territory was still a raw, untamed place where the wind came down off the Laramie Mountains with enough fury to strip the bark from cottonwood trees. The Union Pacific Line had pushed through a decade before, bringing with it a tide of settlers, speculators, and dreamers, but the land itself remained indifferent to all of them. It did not care about your ambitions or your heartbreak. It just stretched on, immense and gorgeous and completely without mercy. Eleanor had arrived in Cheyenne 3 weeks earlier with her 7-year-old daughter, Clara, a trunk of practical clothing, $230 sewed into the hem of her traveling coat, and a deed to 80 acres of land that had belonged to her late husband's uncle. The uncle had died without children of his own, and the land had passed to Eleanor's husband, Thomas, who had then died of typhoid fever in St. Louis before he ever set eyes on the property. That left Eleanor the sole heir, and she had made a decision that everyone in her life had called reckless, stupid, and worse. She had packed up what remained of her life in Missouri and pointed herself west. She was not running from grief exactly. She understood grief well enough by now, having lived inside it for 18 months. She was running towards something, though she could not have told you precisely what. Possibility, maybe. The chance to be something other than Thomas Marsh's widow. At 28 years old, she was not prepared to let that be the whole of her story. The 80 acres sat roughly 40 miles southeast of Cheyenne, near a small settlement called Dry Creek that was not much more than a general store, a post office operating out of someone's kitchen, a livery stable, and a church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays. The land itself had a low house on it, built of rough-hewn timber and river stone, solid enough but in need of considerable work. There was a well that appeared to still be functioning, a barn that listed slightly to the left, and about 50 acres of grassland that had gone wild but could, with labor and time, be turned into something productive. Eleanor had no illusions about what she was undertaking. She had grown up on a farm in western Missouri, and she knew what hard work looked like. She was not afraid of it. What she was afraid of, though she would not have admitted it to anyone, was the loneliness, the long nights, the silence that had a way of pressing in until it felt solid, like walls. She had been making reasonable progress on her first week at the property when a wheel on her wagon gave way on the soft ground near the creek bed. The soil there was deceptively firm on top and marshy beneath, and the left rear wheel sank to the axle before she fully understood what was happening. She had Clara beside her on the bench seat, and the two of them sat there for a long moment looking at each other with the particular calm of people who have already survived considerable difficulty and know that panic solves nothing. Eleanor climbed down and began trying to work the wheel free with a fence post she found near the tree line. She had been at it for the better part of an hour, her skirt muddy to the knee and her temper fraying, when she heard the sound of hoofbeats on the road above the creek bank. A man appeared at the top of the bank, seated on a large sorrel horse, looking down at the situation with calm brown eyes. He was somewhere in his early 30s, lean in the way that men who work outdoors tend to be, with a jaw that carried 2 days of stubble and a battered hat that had clearly seen significant weather. He wore a chambray shirt, canvas trousers, and worn leather boots, and there was a coiled rope on his saddle and a rifle in the scabbard on his left. He looked like what he was, which was a man who made his living from the land and did not spend a great deal of time worrying about appearances. He took in the situation without any of the theatrics Eleanor had come to expect from men who spotted a woman in difficulty. He did not whistle or make any comment about the predicament. He simply swung down from his horse, tied it off on a nearby branch, and slid down the bank to where she stood. "Got a good rope," he said. "If you have another horse or a mule, we can pull it free. If not, I can ride back to my place and bring the draft horse. Either way, we will get it out." "I have a mule," Eleanor said. "He is grazing upstream. He does not respond particularly well to strangers." "I have a way with mules," the man said, and there was a quiet confidence in his voice that was not boastfulness, just simple fact. He went and got her mule, whose name, Clara announced from the wagon seat, was Gerald. The mule regarded the stranger with the usual mule skepticism but did not kick him, which Eleanor considered a good sign. Within 20 minutes, through a combination of rope work, precise positioning, and what appeared to be some kind of personal negotiation conducted in low tones between the man and Gerald, the wagon wheel came free of the mud with a sucking sound, and the wagon rolled up onto solid ground. The man wiped his hands on his trousers and looked at the wheel to make sure it had not sustained any damage. It had not. "Thank you," Eleanor said. She meant it genuinely. "I am Eleanor Marsh. I have taken the old Harlow place on the South Fork." "I know the place," he said. "Needs work, but the bones are good. I am Cole Dutton. My ranch runs along your northern boundary." He looked at Clara, who was watching him with frank curiosity from the wagon seat. "Hello there." "Hello," Clara said. "You talked to Gerald like you knew him. Mules like to know you are not in a hurry," Cole said. "They do not like to be rushed." "Neither does Mama," Clara said. Eleanor felt the color rise in her face. "Clara," Cole Dutton smiled. It was a slow smile, the kind that arrived without any self-consciousness, and it changed his face considerably. "Good to know," he said, and then he untied his horse and mounted up. "If you need anything, the Dutton Ranch is about 2 miles north. The road is well marked." He touched the brim of his hat. "Mrs. Marsh." He rode away up the bank and was gone around the tree line before Eleanor quite had time to formulate a response. She stood there for a moment in the afternoon light with mud on her skirt and a faint, unwelcome warmth in her chest that she categorically refused to examine. "He was nice," Clara said. "He was helpful," Eleanor said precisely, and clicked her tongue at Gerald. Over the following weeks, Eleanor threw herself into the work of the property with the focused energy of someone who had decided that exhaustion was preferable to idle thought. She repaired the roof where shingles had blown loose over the winter. She patched the gaps in the barn wall with fresh timber she traded for at the general store in Dry Creek. She cleared the kitchen garden of 2 years' worth of weeds and turned the soil and got seeds into the ground, while it was still early enough in the season to expect a reasonable harvest. She enrolled Clara in the school at the church on Monday, where a young woman named Miss Abigail Foster presided over 12 students ranging in age from 6 to 14 with remarkable composure. Cole Dutton appeared again on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after the mud incident. He arrived without fanfare, riding the sorrel horse and leading a second animal, a solid-looking paint mare. He found Eleanor on the roof of the barn, nailing down the last of a new section of shingles, and he stood below for a moment looking up at her with an expression that might have been admiration. "Most people would hire that done," he said. "Most people have more money than I do," Eleanor said, and drove another nail. He left the paint mare tied at the post and spent the next 2 hours replacing the rotted fence rails along the east pasture without being asked, and without making any particular comment about it. When Eleanor came down from the barn and found half her fence repaired, she felt a complicated mixture of gratitude and irritation. She brought him a cup of coffee from the pot she kept on the stove, because that was what you did when someone worked on your property, regardless of how complicated your feelings were about it. He sat on the top rail of the fence and drank the coffee and looked out at her land with an expression she could not quite read. "You do not have to do this," she said. "I know," he said. "I am not the kind of woman who needs rescuing, Mr. Dutton." "I can see that," he said. "You were on a barn roof when I arrived." "Then why?" He turned the cup in his hands for a moment. "Because your fence is bad and cattle do not respect bad fences. Some of those are mine." He said it easily, without any implication, and she realized that he was simply stating a practical truth. His cattle probably did run along that fence line. A bad fence was a problem for him as much as for her. She felt slightly foolish for having assumed more than he had offered. "Oh," she said. "Also," he said, and there was that slow smile again, "you make decent coffee." She took the empty cup back to the house and stood at the kitchen window watching him finish the fence rails, and she told herself firmly that gratitude was the only appropriate response to the situation. Cole Dutton was a complicated man to dismiss because he never gave her an obvious reason to do so. He did not flirt. He did not impose. He showed up when there was a practical reason to show up and left when the work was done. And he never once looked at her with the particular expression that men sometimes wore when they were sizing up a widow for remarriage the way they might size up a piece of property for purchase. He treated her like a capable adult who happened to be his neighbor, and that, paradoxically, made her more unsettled than any amount of obvious courtship might have done. She learned about him in pieces, the way you learn about anyone in a small community. He had come to Wyoming from Texas 8 years ago, had started with nothing but a horse and a reputation as a good hand, and had built the Dutton Ranch to its current size of 300 acres through steady work and careful management. He was not rich, but he was solvent, which in Wyoming Territory in 1879 put him ahead of a good many people. He had never married. The people in Dry Creek were vague about why, but the general impression was simply that he had been too busy building something to have time for it. He had a dog named Bishop, a black and white cattle dog with one blue eye and one brown one, who began appearing at Eleanor's fence line about a month after Cole's second visit. She suspected that Bishop was not arriving entirely under his own initiative, but she could not prove it, and the dog was good company on long afternoons, so she fed him biscuits and did not bring it up. Clara adored Bishop absolutely. The dog had the good sense to adore her back, and the two of them could be found on any given afternoon racing around the yard together with the kind of uncomplicated joy that animals and children share and adults spend most of their lives trying to remember. It was Clara who began the more deliberate campaign of bringing Cole Dutton into their orbit, though Eleanor only understood this in retrospect. Clara started it by asking Cole, on one of his fence repair visits, whether he knew how to fish. He said that he did. She asked him if he would show her. He looked at Eleanor. Eleanor, who had been watching her daughter's transparent 7-year-old scheming with a mixture of exasperation and affection, said that it was fine. They could all walk down to the creek on Saturday afternoon. The afternoon at the creek was a mistake, in the sense that Eleanor enjoyed it far too much to pretend it was nothing. They caught 5 small trout between them, which Clara insisted on carrying back to the house herself in Cole's creel, and Cole cooked them over the fire pit behind the house while Eleanor made cornbread, and the 3 of them sat outside in the long summer evening and ate and talked until the stars came out. It was the first time in nearly 2 years that Eleanor had sat in comfortable companionship with another adult in the quiet of the evening, and it felt like something she had been thirsty for without knowing it. She told him about Thomas, that evening, not the whole of it, but enough. She said he had been a good man and a kind husband, and that the typhoid had taken him fast, which was perhaps a mercy. She said that she had thought about staying in St. Louis, but that it had not felt possible to breathe there anymore, every street corner reminding her of something. Cole listened without interrupting, which was rarer than it should have been. He did not offer platitudes. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire, and then he said, "Starting over somewhere new is one of the hardest things there is. But you chose land with good water and your south-facing fields will grow. You made a good choice." It was such a practical response that she almost laughed. "That is what you took from what I just told you. You came here to build something," he said. "That matters. The grief you brought with you is yours to carry, and you will figure out how to carry it. The land, though, the land is the kind of problem that has solutions." She looked at him across the fire for a moment. In the firelight, he looked both older and younger than she had thought him, the lines around his eyes evidence of years squinting into the Wyoming sun, but the eyes themselves still quiet and unhurried. "You are an unusual man, Mr. Dutton," she said. "Cole," he said. "Cole," she repeated, and the name felt strange in her mouth in a way that she did not entirely like, because liking it would have been inconvenient. Summer came on in earnest, and Eleanor's kitchen garden produced enough that she had surplus to trade at the general store. She had also discovered that her property included a small natural spring that she had not known about from the deed description, which fed into the creek and ran reliably even in dry weeks. That spring was worth more than most of the above-ground improvements on the property, and when she mentioned it to Cole in passing, she watched his eyes sharpen with genuine interest. "Water rights matter more than anything else in this territory," he said. "Have you registered it?" She had not. She had not known she needed to. He drove her to Cheyenne 2 days later to file the appropriate documents at the land office, and he sat in the outer room with his hat in his hands while she handled the paperwork, not inserting himself into the transaction but available if she needed him. She did not need him. She filed the papers herself, registered the spring rights in her name, and walked out of the land office with her documentation, feeling more solidly rooted in Wyoming than she had since the day she arrived. He bought her dinner at a restaurant near the railroad depot on the way back, a decent establishment with tablecloths and a menu that ran to actual beef rather than the salt pork Eleanor had been living on. She ordered without fuss and ate without apology, which seemed to amuse him. "Most women would order small," he said. "I have been putting in 10-hour days," she said. "I am hungry." "Good," he said, and refilled her water glass. It was during the drive back from Cheyenne, with the evening light turning the prairie gold and Clara asleep in the wagon bed behind them, that the conversation turned to something more personal than either of them had quite intended. He had been telling her about the early years in Wyoming, about winters that seemed designed to test whether you genuinely wanted to be there, about cattle that died in blizzards and fences that went down under the weight of snow, and the particular loneliness of being the only person within 20 miles who was awake at 3 in the morning when the temperature dropped below zero. "Did you never want someone with you for those nights?" she asked. The question surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. She had not planned to ask it. He was quiet for a mile or so. The horses pulled steadily and the wagon creaked, and Bishop, who had ridden up from Dry Creek in the wagon bed, shifted in his sleep. "I thought about it," Cole said at last. "There were a couple of times I thought about it seriously, but ranching is hard on a marriage, especially when you are building from nothing. I saw too many men whose wives were lonely and miserable and eventually left, and the men were bitter about it afterward. I told myself I would wait until I had something worth sharing." "And now you do?" she asked. She heard the question as soon as it left her and felt the heat rise in her face. He glanced at her sidelong. "Now I have a working ranch with good water and a decent herd," he said, and the tone of his voice was neutral enough that she could not tell whether he was being deliberately obtuse or genuinely just answering the question she had actually asked. She let it go. The stars were coming out over the Laramie Range, and Clara was sleeping peacefully in the wagon bed, and the evening was too beautiful to ruin with the kind of conversation she absolutely did not want to have. August brought a problem that had nothing to do with her heart, and everything to do with practical survival. A man named Harlan Prout, who ran a large cattle operation 20 miles to the north, sent a representative to Eleanor's property with a written offer to buy her 80 acres. The offer was low, insultingly low, but the letter was politely worded, and the representative, a pale young man with an unfortunate mustache, was careful to emphasize what a generous and fair offer it was. Eleanor read the letter twice and handed it back. "No, thank you," she said. The representative looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Prout is a very motivated buyer, Mrs. Marsh." "I am sure he is," Eleanor said, "but the land is not for sale." She mentioned it to Cole the following week in the way that neighbors mention things, and she watched something shift in his expression. "Prout has been trying to expand north for 2 years," he said. "He made an offer on my northern pasture last winter. I declined." "Is he the kind of man who accepts declining gracefully?" Cole was quiet for a moment. "He is the kind of man who is used to getting what he wants eventually," he said. "He will come back with a better offer. And if the offer does not work, he will try other things." "What kind of other things?" "Disputing water rights, moving fence lines. The spring you registered matters, Eleanor. It is one of the reasons he wants the land. He needs that water access for the summer drives." She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "He cannot take it legally. I have registered the rights." "Legal and what Harlan Pruitt actually does are not always the same thing," Cole said carefully. "I am not trying to frighten you. I am trying to make sure you understand the situation." She understood it. And she appreciated that he had told her plainly, without dramatics, treating her like someone who could handle the truth. She spent the next week making sure she had copies of every piece of documentation related to the land in the spring, and she began keeping a written log of her dates and activities on the property, on the advice of Miss Foster's father, who had practiced law back east before his health had brought him west. Pruitt's second offer arrived in September, higher this time but still not fair. Eleanor declined it again, this time in writing, and sent the written response with the representative. 3 days later, she found that someone had moved the fence markers on her east boundary line overnight, shifting them inward by what appeared to be about 40 feet. She walked the line twice to be sure, and then she hitched Gerald to the wagon and drove to Cole's ranch. He came back with her immediately without any fuss or unnecessary comment. He walked the line himself, checking against his own records of the boundary, and confirmed what she already knew. "I will ride to Cheyenne tomorrow," he said. "Get a surveyor out here within the week. In the meantime, do not move the markers back yourself. Let the survey establish the correct line legally. This is Pruitt." "Almost certainly," Cole said. He looked at the moved markers with an expression that was calm on the surface but had something harder underneath it. "He is testing whether you will be intimidated. He is going to find that he has badly misjudged me," Eleanor said. Cole looked at her then, and there was something in his expression that she had not quite seen from him before, a kind of warmth that went beyond neighborly concern, and it was there for only a moment before he looked back at the markers. "Yes," he said quietly, "he is." The surveyor came, established the correct boundary line, and Eleanor filed the survey results with the county. Pruitt's representative did not appear again that fall, though Eleanor remained watchful. Cole began riding the boundary between their properties on his regular morning rounds, not dramatically, not with any display, just as part of what he did. By October, the kitchen garden had been put to bed for winter, and the barn had been properly repaired, and Eleanor had 2 laying hens and a rooster that she had traded a cord of split wood for at the general store. The house was warm and reasonably comfortable, with rag rugs on the floors and curtains she had made herself from flour sacking, dyed a serviceable blue. Clara had made 3 friends at school and had become deeply attached to Bishop, who now appeared at the fence line daily whether Cole was with him or not. It was on a Saturday in October, with the aspens on the creek bank blazing gold and the air carrying the first real bite of coming winter, that Eleanor made her mistake. She had invited Cole to supper, which she had done twice before without incident. He arrived at 6 o'clock with a jar of honey from a neighbor's hive and a small carved wooden horse for Clara, who received it with the solemn delight of a child who understands that a gift has been made by hand. Supper was venison stew and cornbread and the last of the kitchen tomatoes, and they ate at the table with the lamp lit and Clara chattering about school, until she ran out of energy somewhere in the middle of dessert and fell asleep leaning against Eleanor's arm. Eleanor carried her to bed, tucked her in, and came back to find Cole had cleared the table and was washing dishes at the basin with the quiet efficiency of a man who grew up doing domestic work and saw no reason to make a production of it. "You do not have to do that," she said. "You cooked," he said. She stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him for a moment, and felt the complicated warmth in her chest that she had been carefully refusing to examine for 4 months now, and she made the mistake of letting herself look at him the way she had been avoiding looking at him, which was honestly. He was a good man. She had enough experience to know the difference between a good man and a man who was merely convenient or attractive. He was patient and steady and practical and kind. Not the showy kind of kind that advertises itself, but the real kind that simply does things. He was also, she acknowledged to the honest part of herself, someone she had been thinking about more often than was strictly explicable by neighborly concern. He turned from the dishes and found her looking at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The lamp threw warm light across the kitchen, and outside the wind had picked up in the aspens and the stove ticked quietly with the cooling of the fire. "Eleanor," he said. "Do not," she said. He waited. "I am not going to marry again," she said. It came out more abruptly than she had intended, landing in the quiet kitchen like a stone dropped in still water. He looked at her for a long moment, and there was no hurt in his expression, no offense, no withdrawal. He simply looked at her with those calm brown eyes, and then he said, "I can be patient." She did not know what to do with that. She had been braced for argument, for persuasion, for the kind of gentle pressure that men applied when they wanted something. She had not been prepared for 3 quiet words delivered without demand or condition. "I mean it," she said. "I buried Thomas. I know what it is to love someone and lose them. I am not going to put myself through that again." "I heard you," he said. "You cannot just say you will be patient and expect that to be enough." "I do not expect anything," he said. He picked up his hat from the hook by the door. "I am your neighbor, Eleanor. I am not going anywhere." He put the hat on. "Thank you for supper. It was the best meal I have had in a considerable time." He went out into the October night, and she heard his horse move away in the dark. And she stood at the kitchen window with her hand flat on the cold glass, and felt the particular helplessness of being perfectly clear about what you want and perfectly clear at the same time that it might be wrong. November arrived with wind and the first serious snow, and with it arrived a problem that distracted Eleanor thoroughly from her internal complications. The well began running low in a way that suggested something had shifted in the underground drainage, possibly related to the cold. She spent 3 days trying to solve it herself before accepting that she needed help. She did not go to Cole. She went instead to a man in Dry Creek named Oscar Lundgren, a Swedish immigrant in his 60s who apparently had some gift for understanding the behavior of underground water. Oscar came out, spent an afternoon pacing around the well and the spring and the creek bank with his eyes half closed, and declared that there was a secondary water table accessible at about 20 feet depth, 30 yards east of the current well, and that if she put a new well there, she would have reliable water year-round. Cole heard about this from Oscar himself, apparently, because 2 days later he arrived with a young man named Hector Reyes, who was currently working on the Dutton Ranch, and who turned out to be extraordinarily capable at the physical work of well digging. The 2 of them dug the new well in 4 days, which was remarkable given the ground was already partly frozen, and they installed a proper pump and casing, and Eleanor paid for the materials and fed them both at lunch every day, and did not comment on the fact that Cole came every day when he did not strictly need to. On the last day, when the well was finished and Hector had ridden back to the ranch, she and Cole stood at the pump and she worked the handle, and clean, cold water came up clear and steady. "It is a good well," he said. "It is a very good well," she agreed. They stood there in the cold November air, and she was aware of how close they were standing, close enough that she could have touched his arm without extending her reach, and she was also aware that he was not moving closer. He was simply there, in the easy way he always was, not demanding anything, not expecting anything. She thought about what he had said in October and felt the word patient settle in her chest like a stone that was somehow not unpleasant. "Cole," she said. "Yes." "Why?" He did not ask what she meant. He thought about it for a moment, turning his face slightly into the wind. "Because the right things are worth waiting for," he said. "I have waited 8 years to have a ranch worth being proud of. I have waited through 2 bad winters and a drought and a cattle fever outbreak, and I still have something worth being proud of. Waiting is not the hard part. The hard part is knowing what you are waiting for." He glanced at her. I know. She looked at him for a moment and then looked away, back at the well, at the water that was still settling in the trough. You are making things very difficult for me, she said. I know that too, he said, and there was the slow smile. I am sorry about that part. She was not entirely convinced that he was sorry. Winter came down hard in December, a Wyoming winter that meant business, and Eleanor was immensely grateful for the well, and for the stacked firewood that Cole had helped her put up in November, and for the barn that was properly weatherproofed and keeping her small livestock alive. She and Clara settled into the rhythms of winter, which meant shorter days and longer evenings and more time spent with books, and the small tasks that accumulate during the months when outdoor work is impossible. Cole came by twice a week to check that the water line was not freezing and to bring news from Dry Creek, which was really his excuse and everyone knew it. But Eleanor had stopped fighting the fact of his presence because it was genuinely useful, and because she admitted to herself alone in the dark of winter nights, glad of it. He brought news in January that Harlan Pruitt had purchased the old Carver place to the south, which meant he now had properties on 2 sides of her land rather than one. Cole did not dramatize this, but he was honest about what it might mean. He is positioning, Cole said. He still wants your spring access. He will not act directly as long as the paperwork is solid, but he will wait and watch for any sign that you are considering selling. Then he will wait indefinitely, Eleanor said. That seems to be his strategy with several people, Cole said, including me apparently. There was a dry amusement in his voice that made her want to smile. Are you worried about your ranch? No, he said. My operation is solid. What I am more concerned about is that Pruitt has started using a lawyer out of Cheyenne who specializes in disputing land claims. He challenged the Hendersons' water rights last fall, and the case is still unresolved. Can he challenge mine? I filed everything properly. He can always challenge. He probably will not win, but a legal challenge is expensive and time-consuming regardless of the outcome. He paused. I think you should speak to Mr. Foster again. Document everything meticulously. The strongest position is one where your records are beyond dispute. She did speak to Mr. Foster, who was in agreement with Cole's assessment. She spent a week in January organizing her documentation with the kind of thoroughness that left very little room for challenge. It was tedious work, but there was a satisfaction in it, the satisfaction of having done everything right and being able to prove it. February was the worst month, as it tended to be in Wyoming, with a blizzard that kept Eleanor and Clara indoors for 4 straight days. On the 3rd day of the blizzard, she ran low on firewood, which she had not anticipated, having miscalculated the rate at which the cold was burning through her supply. She rationed carefully, keeping the kitchen warm and letting the rest of the house go cold, and she and Clara slept bundled together in the kitchen. On the 4th morning, the blizzard broke, and by noon she could see across the yard. In the late afternoon, she heard hoofbeats and stepped out onto the porch to find Cole on the sorrel horse, leading a draft animal with 2 full racks of firewood. He had ridden through the post-blizzard snow, which was still chest-high on the horse in drifts, and he looked cold and extremely determined. She stood on the porch and felt something she did not have a name for, watching him come across the snow-covered yard. How did you know? She said. I calculated your wood supply, he said simply. You were 2 cords short for a hard winter. You calculated my wood supply. Is that strange? She could not decide whether it was sweet or alarming. She settled for both. Come in and warm up, she said. He came in and stood by the stove with his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, and she looked at him in her kitchen, snow melting from his coat onto her floor, and she thought that this was a man who had ridden through blizzard aftermath because he had calculated her firewood and found it wanting. She thought about all the small, practical ways he had been taking care of her, not in the way that implied she could not take care of herself, but in the way that said he was paying attention, that she mattered enough to think about. She sat down at the kitchen table because her knees felt suddenly unreliable. Cole, she said. Yes. I told you I was not going to marry again. I remember, he said. I said it because I meant it. Because when Thomas died, I thought I would not survive it, and I know better than to put myself in that position again. I understand that, he said. But I also, she said, and then stopped, because saying it out loud was harder than she had anticipated. She looked at her hands. I also know that I have been telling myself a story about what I want, and I am not sure the story is entirely accurate anymore. He set the mug down very carefully on the counter and turned to look at her properly. The story I have been telling myself, she said, is that what happened with Thomas, the loss of him, is a reason not to love anyone again. But Thomas would not have wanted that story for me. He would have thought it was foolish. She looked up. And I think I have known for a while that it is foolish. I have just been very committed to it because changing it is frightening. Cole did not move from where he stood. He was watching her with an expression that was very still. I am not saying I want to marry you, she said quickly. I am saying that I think I have been using what I told you in October as a wall instead of a truth, and that is not fair to you. Eleanor, he said. Let me finish. I am saying that you have been patient, and I see it, and I know what it costs, and I think she stopped again. I think that you deserve to know that I see it. He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and pulled up a chair and sat down across from her at the table, and he reached out and put his hand over hers, and it was not a demand or a rush but something much more like a question. I am not in a hurry, he said. I told you that. But I would very much like to court you if you are willing, properly, without any expectation of where it leads. She looked at his hand over hers. It was a working hand, calloused and weathered, and it was warm. Properly, she said. Sunday afternoons, he said. When the work allows, walks or dinner. Clara welcome, obviously. No pressure, no rushing. He looked at her steadily. Just time to see what this is. She turned her hand over under his, which was the only answer she needed to give. Spring came back around, and with it the world shaking itself loose from ice, and the courtship that Cole had proposed was precisely what he had described. Sunday afternoons, walks along the creek or the ridge to the east of her property, where you could see 40 miles in clear weather. Dinners that he began contributing to as often as she cooked, arriving with a haunch of venison or a cured ham, and installing himself comfortably in her kitchen without making it feel like an intrusion. He was careful with Clara, never attempting to be a replacement for the father she had lost, but a consistent presence, someone who showed up and kept showing up and could be counted on. Clara, for her part, had made her feelings on the subject perfectly clear by the simple method of calling him Cole within the first week, and trusting him with her important opinions about everything from the best biscuit recipe to the moral character of various students at the Dry Creek School. They had a conversation in April that Eleanor thought about for a long time afterward. They had walked out to the ridge east of her property and sat on a flat rock at the top with the whole of the Wyoming plain spread out below them, and the conversation had circled around to the future in a way that conversation tends to do when 2 people are moving towards something. What do you want? He asked her. Not about them, she understood, but in the larger sense. What did Eleanor Marsh want from her life? She thought about it honestly. I want the land to be producing in 5 years, she said. Real production, cattle or grain or both. I want Clara settled and happy in school. She paused. I want to feel like I built something, not just survived something. You are already building something, he said. What do you want? She asked. He thought about it too. The same things, he said, more or less. I want the Dutton Ranch to be something that lasts, something worth passing down. He looked at the plain below. I would like a family, he said quietly. I am 32 years old and I have a ranch, but I come home to an empty house, and that is fine, it is manageable, but it is not what I want. She sat with that for a moment. Cole. I know, he said. I am scared, she said. I know that too. Of loving someone and then losing them again. I know. He turned to look at her directly, and his expression was honest and open in a way that cost him something. She could see that. I cannot promise you that nothing bad will happen. Nobody can promise that. What I can tell you is that I am as careful a man as I know how to be, and I have every intention of being around for a very long time." She looked at him, at this man who had shown up with a rope on a muddy bank 8 months ago and had been quietly, steadily present ever since, who had calculated her firewood and ridden through blizzard aftermath and fixed her fences and listened to her grieve and never once asked for more than she was willing to give, who had said, "I can be patient," and then had simply been patient without making it into leverage or expectation. She thought about Thomas, who had been a different kind of man but also a good one, who had loved her generously and whom she had loved back, and who would have looked at Cole Dutton and given him a nod of recognition. "I am still scared," she said. "That is all right," he said. She reached over and took his hand, and this time there was no table between them, just the wide Wyoming sky and the plain below, and the two of them on a flat rock, with the spring wind carrying the smell of thawing ground. And she leaned slightly against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her carefully, and they sat like that until the sun started down toward the mountains. Harlan Pruitt made his third and most aggressive move in May. His lawyer in Cheyenne filed a formal challenge to Eleanor's spring water registration, claiming that the original Harlow deed had included an easement for water access that predated her filing, and that Pruitt had purchased along with the Carver property. It was a creative legal argument, and Eleanor's stomach turned unpleasantly when Mr. Foster explained it to her, because creative legal arguments have a way of costing money whether they have merit or not. Mr. Foster thought the argument was without merit. He also thought it would cost Eleanor at minimum $200 to defend against it properly, which was most of what she had left from her travel money. Cole came to the table for that conversation, at Eleanor's request, and he listened to Foster's assessment, and then asked a few precise questions about the specific language of the easement claim. He had, it turned out, a good working knowledge of Wyoming land law, acquired through necessity during his own years of building the ranch. "The easement he is claiming would need to be in the original Harlow deed itself," Cole said, "not in any subsequent document, and Eleanor has a copy of the original deed. If the language is not there, the claim collapses." They spent an afternoon at Eleanor's kitchen table going through the original deed language line by line. The easement was not there. It was simply not in the document, which meant Pruitt's lawyer had either not read the deed or was hoping that Eleanor had not. She wrote a letter to Pruitt's lawyer herself, citing the specific deed language and section numbers and attaching a copy of the relevant passage. She made it clear, politely and precisely, that she was aware of the situation in detail and was prepared to contest it fully if necessary. Cole helped her draft the legal sections. Mr. Foster reviewed it. Pruitt withdrew the challenge 3 weeks later. He did not make another move after that, and Eleanor suspected that he had concluded that she was not a woman who would be worn down by legal harassment, and that the cost of continuing was not worth the potential gain. Cole said when she told him about the withdrawal, "He will leave you alone now. Men like Pruitt respect one thing, which is someone who is more trouble than they are worth." "Is that what I am?" she said. "Trouble," he smiled. "Considerable trouble," he said. "I find it suits you." June arrived, warm and full of wildflowers, and Cole asked her on a Sunday afternoon whether she would like to come to dinner at the Dutton Ranch. He said it with a certain amount of care, which she noticed, and she understood that he was asking her to see his home, which was a different kind of invitation than anything that had come before. She went with Clara on a Sunday when the weather was fine. The Dutton Ranch was not large by grand standards, but it was extremely well managed, and she could see in every detail, from the tight fence lines to the clean water troughs to the organized tack room, the work of a man who took genuine pride in what he had built. The house was a proper timber frame structure, larger than her own, with a covered porch that ran along 2 sides and a kitchen that had clearly been designed by someone who actually used it. He made dinner, she discovered. He was not merely capable of it in the emergency way that many solitary men are capable of cooking. He was genuinely good at it, and the meal he produced was a standing rib roast with roasted vegetables and fresh bread that made Clara's eyes go very wide. "You made bread," Eleanor said. "I have a good recipe," he said. She sat at his table and looked around at the life he had built, the solid house and the well-kept ranch and the dog under the table and the evening light coming through the windows, and she felt the last of the wall she had been maintaining begin to come down, not with drama, not in a rush, just slowly and quietly, like snow melting in spring. After dinner, after Clara had fallen asleep in the sitting room with Bishop across her feet, Cole and Eleanor sat on the porch in the early summer dark and listened to the creek and the crickets. "This is a good life you have made," she said. "Better with company," he said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the dark horizon the way he sometimes did when he was choosing his words carefully. "Eleanor," he said, "I told you I was not in a hurry. I meant that. I still mean it. But I would like you to know," he stopped and started again. "I love you, not in some future conditional way, right now as things are. I love the way you handle difficulty and the way you talked to your daughter and the way you went and filed your own water rights and wrote your own letter to Pruitt's lawyer. I love that you were on your barn roof when I arrived that morning in July." He looked at her. "I am not saying this to put pressure on you. I am saying it because it is true and I think you deserve to know it is true." She was quiet for a moment, listening to the creek. "Cole," she said, "yes, I love you too." She said it simply, because it was simple really, once you stopped arguing with it. "I have been in love with you since approximately February when you showed up in a blizzard with firewood and told me you had calculated my wood supply." He looked at her, and then he laughed, a real laugh surprised out of him, and it was possibly the most attractive thing she had ever seen. "February," he said. "The firewood calculation," she said. "It was very romantic. I will keep that in mind," he said. He reached over and took her hand and she let him, and the night settled around them warm and full of summer sounds, and the Milky Way was very bright over the Laramie Range, and Eleanor Marsh felt, for the first time in 2.5 years, not merely functional, not merely surviving, but genuinely at peace. They did not immediately discuss marriage. Eleanor had said she would never marry again, and Cole had said he could be patient, and they had agreed without quite discussing it that there was no rush. What existed between them was solid and real, and solid and real things do not need to be hurried into formal shape. It was August before the subject came up again, and it came up because of Clara. Clara had been, by this point, in full and cheerful possession of all relevant information about the relationship between her mother and Cole Dutton, as 7-year-olds who pay attention tend to be. She had also been thinking about it with the thorough practicality of a child who had been through significant disruption and was interested in stability. She brought it up at breakfast on a Wednesday with the directness that was one of her most characteristic traits. "If you and Cole got married," she said to Eleanor, "could we live at his house? It has a bigger porch." Eleanor set down her coffee cup. "Clara." "I am just thinking about practical considerations," Clara said, which was so precisely what Eleanor herself said when she was being strategic that Eleanor had to press her lips together. "Those are not currently the relevant considerations," Eleanor said. "What are the relevant considerations? That is between me and Cole. Could I talk to Cole about the relevant considerations? Absolutely not." Clara ate her porridge with an expression of patient forbearance that was also extremely familiar. Eleanor was still thinking about the conversation that evening when she rode over to the Dutton Ranch to return a tool she had borrowed, and she found herself telling Cole about it because she told him most things now and watched him try not to smile. "She is a practical child," he said. "She is a devious child," Eleanor said. "Both," he agreed. They were standing in the barn and the horses shifted in the evening quiet, and Cole looked at her with the expression she knew well by now, the one that was steady and warm and did not demand anything. "Is it entirely a terrible idea?" he said. "What?" "The practical considerations Clara raised." Eleanor looked at him. "Are you asking me what I think you are asking?" "I think I might be," he said. "I want to ask it properly, though, not in a barn." "Cole, Eleanor," he stepped closer. I told you I could be patient and I meant it, but I want a life with you, not just Sundays, not just neighbors. A real life built together with Clara, and if we are fortunate, perhaps more children someday, and the ranch in your land because your spring is better than mine and you know it. I want to wake up in the same house as you and argue about practical considerations over breakfast. He looked at her steadily. I am not asking you to give up who you are or what you have built. I am asking you to build it with me. She looked at him for a long moment, at this man who had been patient and steady and honest for an entire year, who had never pushed, never pressured, never made her feel that his love was conditional on her moving at his pace, who had said I can be patient and then simply been patient and had trusted that to be enough. She thought about Thomas. She let herself think about him fully, without the defensive armor she had worn for 2.5 years. She thought about how he would have found Cole Dutton and what he would have said. She thought he would have said something dry and affectionate about the firewood calculation. She thought he would have approved. I said I would never marry again, she said. I remember, Cole said. I was wrong, she said. Not about the marriage to Thomas, about the never again part. He was very still. Yes, she said. He touched her face very gently, his thumb along her cheekbone, and she leaned into it and closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them he was looking at her with an expression that she thought she could look at for the rest of her life without tiring of it. Yes, he said, because he needed to hear it once more. Yes, she said clearly. He kissed her there in the barn with the horses shifting and the late August light coming through the high windows, and it was nothing like a first kiss, because they had been building toward it for a year. And it was exactly like a first kiss, because it was the first, and she let herself feel it without reservation. When they came out of the barn, they found Clara sitting on the top rail of the fence with Bishop, eating an apple with great serenity, and the look on her face when she saw their expressions told Eleanor that her daughter had definitely done this on purpose with the breakfast conversation. Practical considerations, Eleanor said. Clara smiled. They were married in October, a year and 2 weeks after Cole had said I can be patient in Eleanor's kitchen. The ceremony was held at the church in Dry Creek, which on a Thursday afternoon was serving as a school, and on a Sunday morning was serving as a church, and which on this Saturday was dressed with wildflowers that Clara had gathered with Miss Foster's students, and arranged with concentrated artistic effort in mason jars along the windowsills. The congregation was small and genuine, which was all either of them had wanted. Hector Rays came from the ranch. Mr. and Mrs. Foster came with 3 of their children. Oscar Lundgren came and sat in the back row and looked profoundly satisfied with the outcome, as though he had been quietly engineering it from the day he found Eleanor's second water table. 2 other families from the county came, people who had become real neighbors over the course of the year, and Miss Abigail Foster, who was also Clara's teacher and had become a genuine friend to Eleanor, stood with her at the front of the church. Eleanor wore a dress she had made herself from good blue wool, the same color as the curtains in her kitchen, and she did not pretend it was a first wedding or perform a grief she was not feeling. She walked to the front of the church and stood next to Cole Dutton and said the words clearly and meant every one of them. Cole wore the best of his 2 good shirts and his cleanest hat and looked at her throughout the ceremony with an expression that Bishop, sitting illegally in the back pew next to Clara, seemed to share, which was one of absolute contentment. The wedding supper was at the Dutton Ranch, which had been cleaned and decorated by Clara with the help of the Foster children, and everyone ate and talked until the stars were well up, and then people drifted home and it was just the 3 of them, Eleanor and Cole and Clara, in the house that was now their house, and the night was cool with the first real breath of autumn and the kitchen lamp was lit and Bishop was under the table. Mrs. Dutton, Cole said, testing it. Still Eleanor, she said. Still Eleanor, he agreed and smiled. Clara went to bed with Bishop across her feet and Eleanor and Cole sat at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, and Eleanor thought that this was what she had come west to find, not this specifically. She could not have known to look for this specifically, but this feeling, this solidity, this sense of being in the right place with the right person. She had been afraid of this. She had built a wall against this. She had said never, clearly and with feeling, and then she had been wrong, and being wrong had turned out to be the best thing that had happened to her in years. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That you have a very comfortable kitchen," she said. "Our kitchen," he said. "Our kitchen," she said, and the words settled around her like the warmth from the stove. The first winter of their marriage was the winter Eleanor finally understood what Cole had meant when he talked about the loneliness of winter on the ranch. Not that it was lonely now, it was the opposite of lonely, but she understood what it had been. She understood what it cost a man to maintain that kind of patient steadiness through 8 years of solitary winters, and she loved him for it in a way that went deeper than gratitude. She also discovered, that winter, that she was expecting a child. She told him on a January morning when the snow was deep, and the kitchen was warm, and Clara had already gone to school on the sleigh that Hector drove the ranch children to Dry Creek in on bad weather days. She told him plainly, because that was how they talked to each other, and she watched his face go through several expressions in rapid succession, before settling on something that was so unguarded and joyful that she felt her own eyes fill unexpectedly. He crossed the kitchen and held her face in both hands and looked at her for a moment without speaking. "Are you all right?" he said finally. "I am perfectly all right," she said. "I am also apparently going to be enormous by June." He laughed and pulled her close, and she felt him exhale against her hair in a way that told her how much it meant, how long he had waited for a future that felt this full. Clara received the news with the same thorough practicality she applied to everything. She asked a series of precise questions about logistics and sleeping arrangements, and then said, "I would like a brother, please," and went back to her book. "I will do my best," Eleanor said. The spring of 1881 was a good spring, mild enough for early planting and wet enough that Eleanor's south-facing fields, which Cole had quietly been preparing for proper agricultural use since their marriage, came in green and strong. She had planted winter wheat on the best 40 acres, and it stood in the April light like a promise. Her son was born in June, on a Thursday morning when the kitchen garden was in full flower, and Bishop was stationed outside the bedroom door with an expression of extreme concern that made Clara, who was reporting on his behavior to Eleanor between contractions, laugh until she snorted. The baby was large and healthy and loud, with Cole's brown eyes and Eleanor's stubborn chin, and he arrived in the world with the declaration of someone who had opinions about it already. Cole held him in the kitchen doorway an hour after he arrived, in the morning light, and Eleanor watched from the bed and thought that she had been afraid to love this much, and that the fear had been understandable and also completely and entirely wrong. They named him William Thomas Dutton, Thomas for Eleanor's first husband, whom she would always love in the way you love someone who was part of making you who you are, and William for Cole's grandfather, whom he described as the finest horseman he had ever known. Clara, on the subject of her brother, revised her initial skepticism within approximately 48 hours of his arrival, and became his fiercest advocate and most attentive shadow, a role she took seriously for years. That summer, Hector Reyes fell seriously in love with Miss Abigail Foster, the school teacher, and the resulting courtship provided the entire settlement of Dry Creek with considerable entertainment, as both parties were extremely dignified in public and extremely obvious about their feelings to everyone observing them. Eleanor found this delightful and said so to Cole, who pointed out that people in glass houses ought not to throw stones. "We were not obvious," Eleanor said. "Oscar Lundgren told me in December of 1879 that he expected we would be married within the year," Cole said. "He said he could tell by the way you argued with me about the well placement." "I was not arguing. I was making a technical point about drainage." "You were arguing," he said. "It was very attractive. The wheat harvest in August was good, not exceptional, but solid, which in the first year of proper cultivation was exactly what you hoped for." Eleanor sold the surplus through the grain trader in Cheyenne, and put the money back into the land, which was what you did when you were building something for the long term. Pruitt's operation continued to the south of them, but he had redirected his expansion efforts toward the east and the southwest, away from Eleanor's spring and away from the Dutton Ranch. The legal withdrawal appeared to have been genuine, and whatever calculation Pruitt had made about the cost of further pursuit of her land had evidently come out in her favor. She kept her documentation and remained watchful, but she was no longer anxious. Bishop lived to a remarkable age for a cattle dog, 11 years, dying in the winter of 1890 with his head in Clara's lap and Cole's hand on his side, and the whole family around him in the way that a dog who has been genuinely loved deserves to go. They buried him under the cottonwood by the creek, which Clara said was his favorite place to sit in summer, and she was right. But that was later. In the summer of 1881, Bishop was in excellent health and deeply invested in the Dutton family, and the days were long and warm and full of the work that comes with building something real. Hector and Abigail married in September of that year, in the same church in Dry Creek, and Eleanor stood with Abigail at the front, and Cole sat in the front row with William on his knee and Clara beside him. And the look on Hector's face when Abigail walked in was something Eleanor tucked away in the part of her memory reserved for things that were genuinely beautiful. They stayed after the supper until the stars came out, and drove home through the autumn dark with William asleep in the wagon and Clara leaning against Cole's arm and the whole world quiet and large around them. "I want to tell you something," Eleanor said. "All right," Cole said. "When I said I would never marry again," she said, "I meant it because I thought the pain of losing someone outweighed anything that love could offer. I thought the ledger was simple and that grief was proof of that." He listened. "I was wrong about the ledger," she said. "Love does not protect you from loss, but it does not exist only to be lost. The part before and the part during and this," she gestured at the wagon, the night, the sleeping children, everything. "This is the part that is real. The loss is real too, but it does not cancel this. I was wrong to think that it did." He reached over and covered her hand with his on the reins. "I know you know that," he said. "I think you knew it before you said yes to me." "I did," she admitted. "I was just very invested in the wall." "It was a good wall," he said. "Well built." "Stop complimenting my wall." "You built it yourself," he said. "On a barn roof, probably." She laughed, and the sound of it went out into the dark Wyoming night, and the horses walked steadily, and the stars blazed overhead, and Eleanor Marsh, who had come west with a deed and $230 and a grief she was not sure she would survive, drove home through the autumn with her husband and her children, and a life that was so full and solid and genuinely hers that she sometimes sat with it for a moment in the early mornings just to feel the weight of it. In the years that followed, the Dutton Ranch grew by careful increments, and Eleanor's original 80 acres became formally part of the operation while remaining registered in her name, because she had made that agreement with Cole, and he had agreed without hesitation. The south-facing fields alternated between wheat and hay, and a small orchard of apple trees that took 4 years to produce, but then produced magnificently. The spring water ran clear and reliable through drought years when the creek ran low, and Eleanor never once took it for granted. William grew into a boy who was half Cole's steadiness and half Eleanor's stubbornness, which meant he was simultaneously reliable and immovable on subjects he had decided about. Clara grew into a young woman of remarkable capability who at 17 announced her intention to study medicine, which was not common for a woman in Wyoming in 1889, but which she pursued with the same methodical determination that characterized everything she did. Eleanor supported her completely. Cole provided the tuition money without being asked. Their second child, a daughter they named Rose, arrived in 1883, followed 2 years later by another son, Daniel, who had the blue eyes that skipped from Cole's side of the family, and a talent for getting into precisely the kind of trouble that was somehow never genuinely serious but always spectacular. By 1885, the Dry Creek settlement had grown considerably. The post office had become a proper building. A second store had opened. The church had been expanded, and the school met in its own dedicated space. The railroad spur that people had been discussing for years was actually under construction, 20 miles to the west. Oscar Lundgren died peacefully in the autumn of 1886 at his own kitchen table, with his coffee cup in his hand and his cat on his lap. He had never taken $1 for finding Eleanor's second water table, having refused payment each time it was offered, saying only that he liked to see good water go to people who would use it well. Eleanor planted a cottonwood on the boundary between their properties in his memory, and it grew. Hector and Abigail Rays had 4 children, all under the age of 8, and the Rays and Dutton households had achieved the kind of deep neighborly connection that makes a community feel like one. In the spring of 1888, Eleanor stood in the south-facing wheat field on a morning in May when the wheat was just beginning to come in green, and the mountains were still white with the last of the winter snow, and the sky was the particular shade of blue that only exists in Wyoming. And she thought about the morning she had arrived at this property, 9 years ago, with her trunk and her grief and her determination, and she tried to construct some narrative bridge between that woman and this one. But they were the same woman. She understood that she had always been both of them simultaneously, the one who had survived and the one who was building. Cole came up behind her and stood beside her without announcement because they had long since stopped needing to announce themselves to each other. She leaned back against him and he put his arm around her and they stood looking at the wheat in the May morning. "Do you remember," she said, "that you told me the south-facing fields would grow?" "I remember," he said. "You were right. I usually am about land," he said. "About people, I sometimes have to wait longer for the evidence." "Are you including yourself in that?" "I might be," he said. She turned to look at him. He was 41 years old, and the years had put more lines in his face and more silver in his hair at the temples, and he was the most familiar person she had ever known, familiar in the way of someone whose habits and expressions and silences and laughter have become part of the fabric of your own interior life. "You were right about us too," she said. "I hoped I was," he said. "I was not certain." "When were you certain?" He thought about it. "When you came back from Cheyenne with the water documentation," he said. "You walked out of that land office looking like you had just defeated an army, and I thought, I would like to be on that woman's side for the rest of my life." She turned back to the wheat field. "That is a very practical reason to fall in love." "It is also a very good reason," he said. She thought about the wall she had built so carefully and how it had come down not in a dramatic moment, but in a long, slow accumulation of moments that were too genuine and too specific to argue with. A man who fixed fences. A man who talked to a mule about patience. A man who calculated firewood. A man who sat on a porch and said, "I can be patient," and then simply was. "Cole," she said. "Yes. Thank you." "For what?" "For being patient," she said. "For meaning it when you said it, for not making it a condition." He was quiet for a moment. "You would have found your way to it eventually," he said. "I might have," she said. "But it matters that you gave me the space to." The wheat moved in the spring wind, and the mountains were white and clear against the blue sky, and somewhere behind them in the house she could hear Daniel and Rose arguing about something, and William's voice attempting mediation with his father's precise calm, and Bishop barking once at whatever was passing along the road. This was the life she had come west to find. This land, these people, this man beside her. This was what had been on the other side of the wall she had built against it. And it was better and more real and more difficult and more worth it than anything she had been capable of imagining on the morning. She loaded her trunk and her grief into a wagon in St. Louis and pointed herself at the horizon. She had said she would never marry again, and she had been entirely certain of it, certain enough to say it to a man who was looking at her with warm, steady eyes in a kitchen that smelled like coffee. And he had said, "I can be patient." And then he had been, and she had been wrong, and being wrong had given her everything. The wheat grew in the south-facing fields all through the summer of 1888, and the harvest was the best they had seen. and Eleanor and Cole worked the harvest side by side in the good Wyoming autumn. And in the evenings, they sat on the porch of the house that they had built together, slowly, over years, adding a room and a proper window and a covered walkway to the barn, and watched their children race each other across the yard in the last of the daylight. And the sky went pink, and then gold, and then the particular blue of coming night over the Laramie Range. Clara came home from her studies in Denver that Christmas, taller and more certain than ever of what she wanted to do with her life, and she sat with Eleanor at the kitchen table late one night when the rest of the house was asleep, and she said, "You are happy, Mama." "I am," Eleanor said. "I remember when you were not," Clara said. "When we first came here, you were working very hard, but there was something missing." "Yes," Eleanor said. "Was it him?" Eleanor thought about that honestly. "It was the possibility of him," she said, "or of what he represents. I had closed the door on it, and then I discovered that the door was not as firmly closed as I had thought." Clara smiled. It was Eleanor's own smile, the one that arrived without self-consciousness. "You were so determined to do everything alone," she said. "I was," Eleanor agreed. "I am still not fond of needing help. But you let him help." "He was very strategic about it," Eleanor said. "He helped with things that were genuinely useful to him. Fence lines, practical matters. He never made me feel that I was being assisted. He made me feel that we were neighbors with overlapping interests." "That is very clever," Clara said. "Do not tell him I said so," Eleanor said. "He is already insufferably right about most things." Clara laughed, and the kitchen was warm and the house was quiet around them. And outside the December snow was falling softly on the Dutton Ranch, and on Eleanor's 80 acres to the south, and on the little cottonwood she had planted for Oscar Lundgren, and the world was cold and beautiful and entirely at peace. In the morning, Cole would be up before first light to break ice on the water troughs, and Eleanor would have coffee ready when he came in from the cold, and William would eat an enormous breakfast before riding out with him to check the cattle, and Rose would practice her letters at the kitchen table, and Daniel would find some new and creative difficulty to involve himself in before noon. And the wheat would wait in the south-facing fields under the snow, patient as everything that knows it will grow again in the spring, patient as a man who had said 3 quiet words and meant them completely, patient as a woman who had finally, gratefully, let herself be wrong. This was the life. All of it, the hard parts and the beautiful parts and the ordinary parts that turned out to be the most precious of all. This was what Eleanor Marsh had driven her wagon west toward without knowing its name, and she carried it now in the way you carry something you will never put down, not because you have no choice, but because you would never choose to.